Hello, I'm Elizabeth Swain. I'm an actor, teacher and director. I spent the first 20 years of my career being only an actor, when I did quite a bit of the classics, a lot of Shakespeare. And then I drifted into teaching and directing, and that took up another 20 years of my life. Now I'm in phase 3, where I'm doing all three things as often as I can. We're looking at rhetoric with Shakespeare, but what is rhetoric? It's the art of speaking persuasively. I think that's what all actors must do, whatever the role, whether it's television, film, or a commercial. So in Shakespeare, we do that, and the questions are always exactly the same. What am I saying? How am I saying it? Why am I saying it? And the how becomes important. Why this word and not that word? Because there are so many wonderful words in Shakespeare, and one can be quite overwhelmed by them. But on the other hand, you could be quite overwhelmed by a television script. Now, nowadays, you're being faced with wonderful shows that are set in other times and other galaxies, and the language there tends to be a little more heightened than your typical, or your formerly typical, naturalistic television and film work. So I think this work is becoming increasingly valuable to the actor who wants to focus on film and television. It also applies to any other play you're doing. It's not just Shakespeare. When you're doing Tennessee Williams, you have to look at the way he writes, as you will look at the way your TV writer writes. And if you honor the writing, you are going to be very popular with that writer when you see what that writer is doing. So let's look at a couple of the things that you might want to look at that we do in a Shakespeare class. One of the chief things is antithesis, comparing one thing to another. And if you actually set those things up against each other, for example, "Oh, hateful hands to tear such loving words." If I just said, "Oh, hateful hands to tear such loving words," you get nothing. But the antithesis is hateful hands, loving words. And if you actually use that, then your audience understands you. "Oh, hateful hands to tear such loving words." And I'm setting them up against each other. And you're going to find a lot of that in contemporary scripts. You're going to find that in your television scripts. Look for that, perhaps the most important thing to look at. There are going to be other literary devices. There is, of course, alliteration, onomatopoeia. And another one that's important is irony. And, when Mark Antony says, "And Brutus was an honorable man," he doesn't mean that. And you have to look for that. A lot of contemporary scripts will have that irony. Look for that. And then other techniques that we look at in a Shakespeare class are speaking to the end of your thought, the end of your line. This is a terrible habit that sometimes happens, where you just sort of go, you must speak to the end of your line. Also, finding the operative words. That is something that you have to do with any script. But you do it in a Shakespeare class, you will be pummeled if you don't do that. Another important thing that we look at in a Shakespeare class is imagery. And I always make actors physicalize the imagery because it really gets it into their whole being. When an actor talks about the foul womb of night, you can't just say the foul womb of night. You have got to have a movie in front of you as you're saying it. Two other things that are important to every actor, as is obvious: voice and body. Now, the voice, I think voice work is just as important for the television work. I mean, do you watch television and you see people going, "Oh, no, yes, and they're not on voice." You've got to be on voice. And I hate that television stuff where people are just so not connected to their voice. I think the actor must train that instrument. It is our instrument. A good TV actor, you notice, is just as grounded in her voice as a Shakespearean actor is. The other thing is physically, the body. I do a lot of physical work in my Shakespeare class because I believe that the language must come through. It's not just a talking head. And I think that's just as important for television and film. And I think more so, as I was saying earlier on, in these vast things like Game of Thrones, which I have to confess I have seen not one episode of, but I've heard a lot about. And I can't believe that everything I'm saying that we do in Shakespeare class does not apply fully to a piece like A Game of Thrones. I will be applying all these things that we're talking about as a co-director with Armin Shimmerman of Measure for Measure, which will be opening in February. So we've just started rehearsal. But it's the actors in it are all actors who work on stage and in film and television. There is that thing of, oh, I've been doing too much television, I'm getting too small. But no, don't get too small. Yes, there is a difference in technique, but I think the groundwork is the same, and I hope that's what you can take away, and you'll see it at work in Measure for Measure, I hope.